Okay, so today we'll be talking about cultural geography. Cultural geography is the study of humans within the context of geography. So, where they're located and how those locations and their interaction with the environment, and the other five themes, how those affect cultural development. Cultural geography can be split into multiple areas of study. The first and the one we're going to focus on pretty heavily in this lesson is language. There's also religion, race, and all of the subcategories that are associated with race, which I'll talk about more. Politics. This means not only like your traditional, necessarily like Democrats and Republicans that you experience in the United States, but also just like sort of how governments are administered, or how they're run in different parts of the world, and also just relationships of power between different groups of humans. Business, which is the money side of things, and that is all. So we're going to start with just talking about cultural geography, and it's a pretty broad concept. Geography is sort of split into two areas, cultural and physical, and we'll be talking about both areas in this class, but cultural is pretty broad, just like physical is. And then, like I said, it goes over a lot of the same things that I already listed. So let's talk about language first. And here's a Calvin and Hobbes comic that I included. And if you don't like Calvin and Hobbes, you should. You should absolutely like Calvin and Hobbes. So Google some of the comic strips. They're pretty wonderful. They stopped making them before most of you guys were alive, but they're pretty great. So here he's talking about verbing something. And a really good example of that is how Google is a search engine and how Googling is a verb. I thought that was particularly funny. But for you to understand sort of how that applies to language, language sort of changes. And Calvin verbing something, just like how you might notice that like things like selfie and LOL and Google have been added to dictionaries within your lifetime. This is the idea that languages grow and change, and the reason this is important is because they were previously part of a historic language, and now they're grouped into things called language families, which are based on where they came from originally. Sort of, if you can think of having a common ancestor, like a grandparent or a great grandparent or something, and how you're part of the family with people that share that ancestor. Languages are sort of the same way. So then they sort of branch out. The Indo-European family is half of the world's languages. So it comes from Indo, meaning India, and European, obviously Europe. And so it sort of covers a lot of languages that have branched out since then, and cover the sort of geography between those two areas. And that is roughly half of the world's linguistic family. It includes Germanic and Romance, which are probably the languages you'll be most familiar with. Germanic languages are ones that are based on that come from German heritage, and English is a Germanic language. And Romance are ones that have come from Rome and particularly are derived from Latin. So Germanic languages include German, obviously, and then English, which are probably the two most well-known that you guys will encounter. And then Romance are your French, your Spanish, your Romanian, Portuguese, Italian, and anything that is sort of derived from those. Obviously, we don't all understand each other. People that speak French and Spanish can't understand one another, and those languages are closer than English and other languages, and so it makes that pretty difficult, but they do share a common origin. So, okay. From language branches, then they branch into language groups. Okay, and so those are the ones that have similar vocabulary and grammar. A good example of this would be what is a good example of this? Spanish and Portuguese. So Spanish and Portuguese are pretty similar. I think that those would be considered part of the same language group. I'll double check on that and get back to you. Okay, so but we can also understand that there are sort of dialects, and so we might ask ourselves, well, someone is from Glasgow, which is the capital of Scotland, and Chicago. They might be able to talk to one another, but they're going to have trouble understanding one another. If you've ever talked to someone with a really heavy British accent, and the British accent isn't the hardest to understand, but if you've ever talked to someone from Australia, that can be difficult sometimes because those can be pretty thick. And so that's where we sort of get this idea of dialects. We also have things called pidgins. Pidgins are blends of different languages. A really good example of this is Creole, which in Louisiana, if you've ever been, and particularly in New Orleans, they were originally a Spanish colony, and then they became a French colony, and then they became an English colony, and they had a lot of slaves from West Africa, and all of these languages end up getting mixed together, and you get a pidgin language that combines elements of all of those. And Creole is one of the best examples of a pidgin language, and probably the one you'd be most exposed to. Lingua franca is a language, is sort of a language like a bridge language. And so for people who don't necessarily understand the other one's language, so if you're talking about someone from we'll say Saudi Arabia and someone from China, they don't speak the same language, and so they would have a lingua franca, which for most people is English. It also at one point was French, and French is still in some ways considered what's the diplomatic language of the world. That's why if you ever see the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, it's in French first. So French, English, and Chinese are three really common lingua francas, languages that are used to sort of bridge gaps between people that don't speak the same language. And then lastly, I want to talk about the idea of official languages, which is that governments have a particular language that is mandated. So America does not have an official language. English is our common language, and that's what most people here speak, but it is not an official language in the sense that there is anything in the government that says you have to speak English or else. That's not really a rule. You've probably seen this with people who speak Spanish and they're Spanish on signs because Spanish is becoming increasingly more common. We do not have an official language in America. France, on the other hand, does have an official language. It's French. Their official language is French. And so if you ever go there, then your government documents are only going to be in French because everyone is expected to know French. So the official language can be decided on the government. You can have multiple official languages. A really good example of this would be, I want to say South Africa, which has English, and Afrikaans, which is a language that was sort of derived from the Dutch. And so those are both official languages down there. And so you have multiple official languages, which means your government documents are going to be in both. Another one is if you've ever been to Quebec or if you know about Quebec in Canada, their official languages are English and French. Okay, we're going to move on to world religions, and then after that, this is going to be it for this particular presentation, but I do want to talk about religion because it is important in shaping culture. I included a picture here with, I shouldn't say I included, the slide is from Mr. McGee, there's a picture here with multiple religious symbols, and if I can get my cursor to fall around, I'll tell you what they are. We're going to be focusing on the 5 major religions of the world, and there are clearly more. There are 7 here. But this is the symbol for Islam. This is the symbol for Judaism. This is the symbol for Sikhism, which we won't be talking about, but if you're interested in learning about, I can tell you. This is a mandala, and it's the symbol for... actually, that's not a mandala. Sorry, that's not a mandala. It's the 8-spoke wheel. This is the symbol for Buddhism. And this is the cross, which is the symbol for Christianity, the one you'll be the most familiar with. This is Hinduism. And I believe that that's the symbol for Om, which is the sort of holy word. And then this is the symbol for Taoism or Taoism, which is really common in China and in Japan, more so China. We are going to be focusing on the big five, which are, hold on just a second, which are, if I can go back, Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and Hinduism. Taoism and Sikhism are more regional, and we won't be focusing on them. Okay, so it is a religion's a value system that incorporates worship and faith in a divine creative force. That's a little bit confusing because the idea of a divine creative force within Christianity, it's the idea of God, but within other religions, it is the idea of there can be other things that are responsible for sort of creating the universe. It's a little bit more complicated, and we're not necessarily going to talk about it in this class, but you can have a religion that does not have a divine creative force, but it does have to have very specific rules in the belief system. We'll talk about that more, but for the time being, the religions we're going to be talking about, they all believe in some sort of higher power or sort of thing beyond the physical responsible for creating the world. And they have a really big impact on geography, and they also have a pretty large impact on strife affecting the world. And I want to talk about that for just a second because